If you already have a thorough understanding of the nature of objects in JavaScript, you can skip this topic. I've included it because before I start talking about prototypes, I want to make sure the nature of objects is understood. This is especially important for those that may be coming to JavaScript from another language. We've used objects numerous times in this course already, so it may seem a bit strange to cover the nature of objects now. However, there are many that work with objects in JavaScript without understanding them completely. Sometimes it is better to have some experience with objects before diving into the true nature of objects, which is what we're doing in this section. So put simply, an object is a composite value. It brings multiple data pieces, primitives or other objects, together under a single reference. An object is an unordered collection of properties, and each property has a name and a value. The name of the property is usually a string, but it can also be a symbol. The value can be any data type available in JavaScript. So we speak about properties as having name-value pairs. Now, before we go any further, let me start creating an object. So I'm going to declare the variable, and then I'm going to define that object using an object literal. So first, fname. I'm just going to put information about myself in here in this object. So basically right now what we have are two properties, an fname property and an lname property. And notice that each of these properties have a name and a value. In the case of these two, the values are strings. Now when you're defining an object, each property must be separated by a comma, which I've done here. Now the name is referred sometimes as a key. So we talk about properties as a key value pair as well. Now to throw in a different data type, here is a property that stores a number. So the name is score, the value is 90. And a property that stores a Boolean. Now we said that the value of a property can be any data type that's available in JavaScript. So we can do other object types. For example, an array. So if I do quizzes here and then set that up as an array, and it just contains some quiz information, basically quizzes that have been taken, perhaps something like that. There I have an array. Another type of object could be any of the built-in objects that are available in JavaScript. One of those being, of course, the date object. So this object is created, and I just create a new date object, and that becomes the value of that property. And then, of course, we can just have a standard object. Say I have an address in here, and that is an object, and it contains properties inside it. Let's see, just do 45 main, and then city Lehigh. So there we have several different data types associated with properties. Now the one thing we haven't added yet is we haven't added a function to a property. And when the value is a function, we call that a method. So basically, an object property that points to a function is a method. Now, methods can be set up in two different ways. Let's say I wanted a full name property, and this is going to be a method. This points to a function. So here's one way to set it up. This is the traditional way. We just define a function here. Now I'm using this to refer back to the object. And I'm grabbing fname, and I'm just concatenating that with lname. So I use this again like that. Now I said there's two ways to define a method to attach a function to a property. This is the traditional way, but in a recent release of ECMAScript, they've simplified this. So I can define this same method like that. Much simpler to do. Now here we've created an object using an object literal. That's what we call this. But there are multiple ways to create objects in JavaScript. And for example, every time we create a function, an object is created using the function constructor. And that's just a special type of object. Every time we create an array, an object is created using the array constructor, which is a special type of object. So a lot of different ways to create objects, but even when we're creating a standard object like I've done here, there are multiple ways to do that. And we'll dive into a lot of those different ways of doing that when we look at the section on structuring code using objects and object-oriented principles as they're applied to JavaScript. So that's where we'll cover some of these different ways of creating objects, because those become patterns if you're structuring your code using objects. Now, let's go ahead and save this object and take a look at it. I'm going to move this in a bit and open up the console here and just do obj, and there we can see the object and all of its different properties. The name value pairs, which we see inside of this object. Now, in order to access a value that is associated with a property, we traditionally use the dot syntax. So I can access fname like that, and it displays the value for that particular property. But we're not limited to just dot syntax. We can use square brackets as well. And this becomes very useful when we need to do certain things programmatically. So for example, if I pass in the string address inside of square brackets, it's going to look up obj.address, and it's going to return the value for that property, as we can see there. Now, this can also be used when assigning values to an object. So let me jump back to Visual Studio Code here, and up here I'm going to first define a couple variables. One is data name. I'm going to set that equal to a string final, and then the other one, let's just go data val, and let's set that equal to 80. Now we're going to use these values to create another property on the obj object. Now we could do that inside of this object literal. We could do it like this. I put square brackets and then the data name. That's what I want. I want final to be the name of the name value pair. And so I put square brackets around it. Then I put the colon like that, and then I can just associate the value with it. Now let's go ahead and save that and take a look at the object. Make sure that we're actually seeing that. So if I open up this object and we have final and it's 80, and so that worked for us. Now another way could have been to assign it here. I could do obj and then inside of square brackets data name. Whoops. And you can see right now it's retrieving the value, so we could use it to retrieve or we could use it to set. If I set it to 90, what happens? Case sensitive. There we go. The score is now showing 90. Now, something else this shows us is that objects are mutable, meaning they can be changed. Now, even if we had defined this object with const keyword, that would make it so that we couldn't assign another value to this variable. That's all that would happen. We could still change all the properties inside the object because objects are mutable. So using const is not going to prevent us from changing properties inside of an object. Now, there are some commands to help us make objects so they are more immutable, so we can't change them. And in order to introduce that, we have to be aware that each property contains attributes. Attributes are associated with each property on an object, and these attributes determine what we can do with that property. So let me just go through the three main attributes. One is writable. So the writable attribute determines if the value can be changed or not. So if writable is set to false on fname, I can't change that value. It won't allow me to change it. All right. There's also an attribute configurable. And the configurable attribute determines two things. One, it determines whether or not we can delete the property from the object. So if it's false, we can't delete it. The other thing it determines is if we can change the attributes for that property. So once attributes are set, if we set configurable to false, we can't change those attributes. That's what it's going to prevent us from doing. Now, there is one caveat to that. If we set configurable to false, we can change writable to false. The JavaScript engine allows that. But that is the only scenario where we could actually do a change if configurable were false. Now, the last attribute I need to mention is enumerable. Now, the enumerable attribute determines if the property is returned by certain actions. For example, a for-in loop will not show a property with an attribute of enumerable set to false. It just won't show up. Now, by default, for this object we've created here, by default, all of these are set to true. And we can see that with a simple JavaScript command. Let me just save what I've done there. This is a static method of object constructor. And it's get own property descriptor. It's a pretty long one. So if we pass in obj and then we pass in the property that we want to see its attributes for, let's do fname. It will return the information on that. So the value is Steve shows us, and then writable is set to true, enumerable is set to true, and configurable is set to true. So we can see what they are. And by default, that's what is assigned to every property, true, true, and true. Now, how could you change that? Well, let's go ahead and define a new property. You know what? Let me go ahead and do that inside of Visual Studio Code so that you'll have a record of it. Define property. And then, once again, this is a static method. So object.define property. And then we pass in the object. And then we pass in the property that we want to act on. I'm going to create a new one. So I'm going to do B-Day for birthday. Now, the third parameter is an object. And this object has the attributes in it that we want to define. So one is value. I'm going to set that to May 25. Then we can do the writable, configurable, and enumerable properties we've talked about. So let's do writable. And let's set that to false. I'm going to set these to false on all of these since true is the default. All right, let's go ahead and save that, and now let's see what we get. So if we take a look at obj, we can open it up and we can see there is now a B-Day property, and it's set to May 25th. Can we display it? obj.bday. Sure, we can display it. Can we change it? Well, let's try. obj.bday. Let's set that equal to June 25th. It looks like it changes, and this is what I think is a problem with this. It looks like it changes, But when we display obj again and open it up, or when we take a look at the bday property of obj, it's still set to its original value. So it doesn't allow us to change that. Now, what about the configurable property? Let's try to change that same property again. I'm going to copy in this same command. Let's try to set it up again, and let's set writable to true. Now, if I press return, notice we get an error, type error, cannot define property. It won't allow us to do that. Now, one more thing I want to show, just a for in loop. So let's do let I and then we'll just console.log I like that. So there's a for in loop to loop through all of the properties of the object. Now, if we look through that, we don't see a bday because it's not enumerable. Let's try one more thing. Here's another static method. And this will retrieve the keys of the key value pairs, the key of the property. We also called that name, but I mentioned that it was called keys as well. So if we display that, basically what that does is that creates an array. But notice bday is missing, and that's because the enumerable attribute is set to false. Now there's a similar command, object.values, that retrieves the values and puts them in an array like this. So some nice static methods to be aware of. But basically, using these different commands to show you the nature of objects, what objects are like in JavaScript. And with that grounding, we are ready to begin talking about prototypes, a very important concept when it comes to objects in JavaScript. So let's move on.